Sure. Just for the listeners, Rand, the marine chronometer is the device that the British invented, and it takes in the roll, and it works because of the roll and pitch of a ship. A pendulum's clock's not going to work, so pendulums are no good on ships. But so this marine chronometer was able to, go to sea basically, and that's what was invented. Like, I think we talked last time, Rand, and I quite like this, and I had another guy on the show. I didn't quite agree with some of the stuff, but like I was telling him as well about this Tanawa, this device called a Tanawa that the Africans had, and when they were at sea, they were able to have. Now the problem with this is you need to have very advanced moon calculations, but they could have used the moon as a reference point and got longitude that way. Now it's a different way of doing it. It's more intuitive knowledge. They obviously didn't have a technological voice. All they did was like measure the angle to the moon, but if you knew where the moon was going to be over its 19-year cycle, and you'd need to have moon tables. You'd need to know all this. So, yes, that makes it more complicated. But hey, it's another method, and there's evidence that this Tanawa device existed to map longitude.
I think this is entirely true. I think that this is exactly possible. However, I should note that nobody applied to collect the 20,000 pounds using that technique, and nor successfully acquired the money by doing that. So, yeah, that is theoretically in 2020 hindsight. It is true that if you can look back and say they could have, had they known this, then they might have seen this, and that's true. It's true. It's absolutely true. You can, if you have extremely sophisticated knowledge of the movements of the stars and the moons, you can use astronomy to calculate longitude. But it requires immense amounts of observation and continuous over centuries. It's not just like a decade or two. You need centuries of calculations to be able to really have the kind of accuracy that would be required. Incidentally, just speaking of that, I believe that, and this is a startling argument, maybe startling, but I believe that Carthage was once the site of a very ancient civilization.
Really?
And much more older than the Carthaginians, because it was at before the last crustal displacement, it was at 30 degrees latitude, which is exactly what Giza is today.
Right.
Okay, and not only that, but as you looked east towards the rising sun, you also had the Mediterranean. So you had a mirror effect on the sun rising and the stars happening. So it was, I believe, an ideal location for astronomical observation before 9,600 BC. And then the people who survived from the catastrophe that occurred from that material, if it was taken to anywhere else in the world at 30 degrees, like Giza, all the astronomical evidence that you had gathered prior to would be valid in the present era, where the rock crust had ended up. So that's just a side note.
Yeah, just on isn't there a map? I can't remember which one it is now. I think it's they show that Cyan is and the Tropic of Cancer can be calculated, and this anthropomorphic projection that we have centered on Greenwich Mean Time, it's the center of all our maps. That when you take the anthropomorphic projection of another map, it shows that Cyan the Tropic of Cancer could be calculated how much it drifted, and they can actually date these maps when they were actually originally drawn up.
Yeah, that's what we did do in Atlantis Beneath the Ice, and I think we were the first to do that with that. Although I did do it in a paper for an online journal a few years back. What it is because, like you say, the Earth's tilt, say 23.5 degrees. It goes through a cycle, goes down to 21.8, goes up to 24.4. At the time of the last displacement, it was at its greatest, 9,600 BC, at the time when there was this displacement. It was at 24.4. That is its maximum tilt. Today, it's declined down to 23.5, And it continues to decline. It will continue to decline for several thousand more years now until it gets to 21.8, and then we go back up again. So this is a very slow cycle. It takes 41,000 years to complete the cycle.
Mm.
But the point about it is that there's discrepancy when Charles Hapgood was trying to find the center of what's called the Piri-Reis map.
Yeah.
He thought it might have been Sen, which is present-day Aswan, which was very close to the Tropic of Cancer, and so he couldn't determine which it was. And I realized that the drift of the Earth's tilt it can be measured in terms of the seconds, the distance between the Tropic of Cancer now and when it was last over a Sen can be calculated out to an exact date. And that's what we did in Atlantis Beneath the Ice, and that's like
3775 BC, I think it was the last.
That's right. Yeah.
That blows me away, Rand. That just blows me away, because you look and you go, well, you can get so much information out of a map, and this is what I'm talking about. The tangible evidence is there. You just need to know the science of cartography. It's all encoded in the map. You know, there's a high science there. You don't just draw a couple of continents on a map and hopefully you get it to look right. It's much more than that. There's so much science in it.
And the other thing that's interesting is the projection itself is what's called an azimuthal equidistance projection. This is the kind of thing that the Americans used and the Russians used in the Cold War. They would take Moscow, for example, and they'd make that the center of the world, and then they would create a map around Moscow so they could see where's the closest place I could get to Moscow that is in my territory, which turned out to be Turkey, hence the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so those maps, which are sort of orientated towards satellite knowledge of the Earth's geography, this sort of seeing the world from one spot on the Earth. That was what was some of these early maps had used as a projection. The Piri-Reis map, which is the most famous one in Charles Hapgood's maps of the ancient sea kings, is of this nature, and it is only partial. It's a part of it. It shows the eastern side of South America, parts of the Caribbean, parts of Africa, parts of Europe, and that's all it does. But the original map on which it is based, that projection would have gone all the way up to the rest of the world. Sure. And that's what the opening chapter of Atlantis Beneath the Ice is about, is when it's called Memorandum for the President, which is a memorandum that Charles Hapgood wrote for Eisenhower. And Eisenhower acted on it, trying to find and locate the original map of the world that Columbus might have used in his voyages to the New World. Fascinating.
You think Charles Hapgood was up against it in terms of trying to shake a paradigm? Was he meeting deaf ears? I know he had Eisenhower and Einstein on his side, but was he successful in his day in his theories, Rand?
Well, people, especially if you look on the web, will poo-poo him and everything and his achievements and diminish Einstein, etc., and that's all ridiculous. Because it wasn't just him, and as we show on our website too, was Albert Einstein silly? And if you follow through that, you can see also that in addition to Einstein, there was the most famous geologist of his era, whose name is Curtly Mather. Mm-hmm. He was the most prominent geologist. He was in the Department of Geology at Harvard University. He was the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He was elected 4 times to be the president of the American Academy of Arts and Science, and he was the guy who helped who stood up to Joseph McCarthy. He prepared the geological deposition for Clarence Darrow in the Scopes monkey trial. So this is the guy, and he was, if you've heard of Stephen Jay Gould, who was a wonderful writer who's now deceased, but wonderful Harvard professor and popular writer of science, his mentor. So this Kirtley Mather is not a nobody, and he also wrote, and his stuff is in the maps past the pole about supporting Hapgoods theory. Mm-hmm. And I've also acquired information from other sources, which I will be publishing in the future, about meetings that Hapgood had with, particularly one meeting that Hapgood had with about 15 to 20 prominent scientists, a private meeting he had with them, and we have notes. We have acquired the notes from that meeting.
Beautiful.
And they were, and this is the mid 50s, and they were talking about global warming at that time.
Wow.
And that they were taking absolutely seriously what Hapgood was saying. So Hapgood was ahead of his time, and he's probably way too far ahead of his time. I do think that.
Very smart guy, man. Very intelligent, like this guy.
He was a lovely person as well. He was a gentle person. He grew flowers, and he was big into his gardens. And then he stopped growing gardens because his guests keep wanting to cut them, and he couldn't stand the idea of the flowers being cut. And when the ants and insects came in, he just, tried to lead them away to different areas. He never killed anything, and he was a very gentle person.
Wow.
And a very generous person in terms with his time, especially with me. I mean, I was honored to have that correspondence with him. And so, the guy has been mischaracterized. He's been poo-pooed. They try to throw Earth crust displacement into what's called pole shift theories.
Yeah.
And technically speaking, you could, it's really marginal to call Earth crust displacement a pole shift. Because the pole doesn't shift. It's the crust that shifts.
Yeah.
So the axis remains stable in an Earth crust displacement.
The thing about Hapgood theory is it solves so many problems, Rand. It solves so many things.
The placement of the ice sheets, for one thing.
Yeah.
How did they get in? Yeah, where they were. Why weren't they in Alaska and Siberia while they were in New York and Michigan, for example?
That's a major. Maybe just explain that, Rand, a little bit better. That hasn't been explained by or addressed by anybody in the mainstream community.
Well, here's I think the biggest elephant in the room is, where is the greatest glaciation on the planet? Okay, 90% of the world's glaciation is on Antarctica. Mm-hmm. In the northern hemisphere, 90% of the glaciation is on Greenland. Now, Greenland and Antarctica receive less snow than the Sahara Desert receives rain in the areas of the thickest ice. So nothing in the present paradigm, which is the present is the key to the past, that is the mantra of uniformitarianism, the prevailing doctrine of geologists, nothing can explain the fact that the greatest ice sheet in the northern hemisphere and the greatest ice sheet in the southern hemisphere, which are antithetical to each other, are polar deserts. How did the ice get there? And they can't explain it. But Earth crust displacement can. It becomes simple. Once you put the crust in a different position, then you get different rainfall and snowfall patterns. And in a place like Greenland and western greater Antarctica, in the former positions of the Earth's crust over the last 3 displacements, would have received massive amounts of snow. So the snow fell, and it is ancient, and that makes it seem older than it is, because it hasn't fallen since, because it's not falling. It's not really, it's only accumulating in Antarctica on the part that was Atlantis. The 2/3 of Antarctica where 90% of the world's glaciation is not receiving snowfall. Almost all the snowfall in Antarctica is on that side towards South America. That's the side that we say that was once temperate. So the snowfall is covering Atlantis. Atlantis is beneath the ice, but Antarctica, the whole continent itself, to explain the glaciation of our planet, here's another way of looking at it. If you came to this planet from outer space and you saw glaciation that was antipodal and lopsided relative to the pole, that would tell you one thing. Hey, this crust must shift.
Yeah.
It must be
it's not balanced.
Periodically shifting.
Yeah,
that's what you would conclude. And indeed, that's what they did conclude about Mars on that using that idea of antipodes.
Exactly. Okay, Rand, this is what I like about you. You're a prolific researcher, and I know you're at this since 1977, but I can see you blossom through your works and your books. And, this is the thing, this Atlantis Beneath the Ice book it's prolific because you're going into historical accounts, agriculture, cartography, earth crust displacement, and we haven't touched on yet, but you've also gone into mythology and linguistics. Perhaps tell us some about I could talk all day just about the crust displacement and all the other little bits of evidence that make sense, and maybe we'll touch on a couple more, but the mythology and the linguistics is beautiful for me too, and the Haida and Samaria link as well. Tell us about that, Rand.
Haida Gwaii is a island in British Columbia, just south of the Alaska Panhandle. It's in Canada. It's quite a ways away from the mainland, and it's the home of the Haida. And they have lived there, we know, for probably more than 10,000 years. And they have a mythology, a tale that of a former great village that existed before the sky fell, and their story is almost identical in what the motifs that are put together. Motifs in mythology is an icon, if you like, or one idea, like the sky falling, or the flood coming, or the king that survives in a boat. They have this sequence of events that is almost identical to the Sumerian story of the destruction of their original homelands, which they called Dilmun, which was an island in the ocean. And when they say ocean, they are talking about what we would call the Indian Ocean, which is really just simply a part of the world ocean. And so it's to the south. So, of course, Antarctica is to the south. Anyway, the story that is told in the Sumerian tales, and this is the earliest civilization that we have, that we know recorded, is that the sky god conspired with the flood god to destroy mankind, but to save somebody. And that story is exactly told the same way in amongst the Haida. So I was interested in that, and I was trying to find if there was any other relationship between the Haida and the ancient Sumerians. I mean, because this is a long distance. Like, we're talking about Iraq and British Columbia. This is a long way.
Yeah.
That half a continent, half a globe away.
Sure.
So I came across a Russian linguist who claimed that the Haida language, which has never been successfully pigeonholed into any group, they try to push it into a couple of them. They're always having problems with it. And it's sort of like shoehorning it into something that else is happening, and that because it's so peculiar. But this Russian linguist, whose name escapes me at the moment, believed that this ancient Sumerian and Haida have a lot of commonalities. So now you've got a mythological link. They're telling the same story about the flood, how it happened, and what happened after it. And you've got these linguistic connections. So I happen to be a librarian, and I live on Vancouver Island, and the Haida Gwaii is part of the Vancouver Island Regional Library. And I was the extension librarian, and I would fly 4 times a year up to Haida Gwaii. I'm a flying librarian at the time, and meet with people there. And I met a lot of people that were Haida and heard their stories, and so I had direct experience of them. And one of my good friends, his name is Gwaii. It's not the same as Haida Gwaii, but it's Gwaii. It's spelled slightly different. It means for sun as opposed to islands.
Sure.
He and his brother suffer from this relatively rare form of arthritis. It's called ankylosing spondylitis, AS for short.
Sure.
And among it's genetic. It has some properties that are pretty interesting. One of the things is that immunity is great from other diseases. However, it itself can be debilitating because your bones start to fuse in parts like at your pelvis and at your neck.
Wow.
You bent over a little bit, you might go blind.
Wow.
So they have all these blind poets, telling the stories. And this is also true. So I started to look, where is this ankylosing spondylitis as a disease? Because, when I traced it all over the world, and it's really fascinating because here there's quite a bit. First of all, one of the highest concentrations among the Haida. They have a lot. There's some in New Guinea. There's some other parts of British Columbia along the coast. Then there's some in Scandinavia. And there's some in the area of the Middle East, in the area where the Sumerians were.
Wow.
So and there's vast areas in between where that doesn't occur. Like there's nothing in South America. There's nothing hardly any in Asia.
No transmission of the
yeah.
There doesn't seem to be
no
transmission through geography.
Not through land, yeah. It would have to be through boats. So, and also the Haida, where they are most famous for their boats, their cedar canoes.
Wow.
They were the dominant First Nations in terms of they were invulnerable because nobody could get to them. They were on these islands that nobody even knew where they were, but they could attack other places. You see, so they were raiders and they had slaves and everything.
Sure.
But the main thing about it is, at one point, the Sumerian elements who had the ankylosing spondylitis took over Egypt, and then the pharaohs, particularly Ramses the Great, the most famous of the pyramid of the pharaohs, he had ankylosing spondylitis. So bad, his neck was so crinched that they had to break his neck to get him into the coffin.
Wow. So
we have, it seems to me, mythological, linguistic, and genetic links between the Haida of British Columbia and the ancient Sumerians of the Middle East. And because they have a common ancestor in Atlantis, some of them escaped in the flood.
Ancient transoceanic contact in a way, but possibly a common source. That's what I always say. There's ancient transoceanic contact between ancient cultures, but then there's also this common source as well. The common source concept of Atlantis explains everything. That it was like perhaps they went in both directions from the world ocean, yeah? One to Siberia.
That's it.
Fascinating, fascinating. I often think about the megaliths you see, and you know, I researched the megaliths, Rand. Of course, you've done a book review for me, but you know, I talk.
Yes, it's a terrific book.
Yeah, you know, something I'm doing a sequel on, but I fascinates me with this ancient transoceanic contact, and I keep saying that, you know, Sligo Bay and Carnac Bay, they're two landing bays. They're just natural landing bays, and of course they both face the Western Atlantic, and that, you know, there seems to be exactly the same thing. Two peaks, 5,000 BC, a wave of megalith buildings, not very much, but then another wave comes in 3,000 BC. And there's a sunken landmass off the coast of Ireland in Porcupine Bank. Now, there is other stuff in the Azores Plateau as well. And, you know, it all gets explained by rising sea levels, you know, that. And then perhaps that's why they came in waves, the megalithic builders, like.
And the same thing is true on the west coast of North America. In the book, we show the land that's over 1,800 meters, and on the extremities of that land, that high land mass, are four mountains, and Mount Shasta, Mount Rainier, etc. Sure. And each of those mountains have a story that they were the Mount Ararat of their time. This is where people landed at the time of the flood.
Of course, you would go to high ground in a flood, wouldn't you? That's the most natural thing to do. And then that also enhances the agricultural high altitude too, Rand.
Well, yes, absolutely. And another way of looking at it is that if you're not in highland, you're underwater. So there's nothing left for you to say.
Yeah.
It's over.
Sure. Let's talk about the Aymara language, because this one is fascinating for me, Rand. This is bizarre, and you were talking. I could sit and talk about this for hours, I think. And I have this linguistic guy sitting with me at the moment, and he's like, "Really? They were able to decode it in like binary language?" So.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, let's get where the Aymara are.
Yeah.
They're in an area of the Andes. Lake Titicaca is the center of their culture, and it's the highest freshwater lake in South America, and it's the site of some very ancient megaliths, Tiahuanaco, and it's also there's all sorts of myths there about people coming from the south at the time of the flood and arriving there, and they apparently had some sort of a golden wand of some sort, and this wand was like some sort of a beacon thing of some sort, and they followed this beacon until it stuck in the ground, and that turned out to be Cusco. And we believe in the Atlantis blueprint. We believe that that was the site of a cache or, a national revival place, if you like, an Atlantean pit stop, if you like, or some place where they left a bunch of stuff in case of a catastrophe, and they had a beacon to get there. Okay, so these are the people who have this very peculiar language, and this language is pure. There are no exceptions to its grammatical rules. And when I came across this when I was still in London, actually, and it was an article in the Times about this language that experts are saying is an artificially created language, and that there is a fellow, and he still is continuing on with this, who is using this language because it fits so perfectly with computers that it can become a universal translator. And so you take English and you put it into this Aymara in the computer, and then it comes out in Portuguese or Arabic or whatever you want. So it's kind of a bridge language because of its purities and the lack of its ambiguities.
Wow.
So my feeling is that, there's no way of proving this, but it seems as though the Atlanteans had computer science, and that they had evolved their computer science with their language. Even now, our language is starting to change because of computers, but they may have had like centuries of that.
Sure.
And so that could have become like a Latin of its time, if you like, of a universal way of speaking with everybody. This was a common language, and it survived in the Lake Titicaca area among the Amera.
Even like computerized thought, if you want to call it that. You know, this language is like computerized thought, and that it's grammatically checked with a yes, a no, and a maybe. And that's just like binary logic in a way, because we have a yes on, no is off, and a maybe is like can swing either way, it's undecided, like, you know, and it's just like a binary language in a way.
Well, it's actually trilingual.
Sorry, not binary.
Yeah. It's three, and that. I was on another radio show, and somebody at Microsoft phoned up and said, "Oh, that's where our research is going towards trilateral, like rather than binary, but tri." Yes, because the element of uncertainty, and then there's degrees of uncertainty as well in the language. So when you actually say any sentence in Amera, it also tells you just by the structure of the grammar how sure you are of what you're saying.
Wow.
Yeah. So like I dreamt it is one thing, or somebody else told me, it's secondhand, or I saw it, or it's, we all saw it, that kind of thing. So that even...
Sorry, Ron, what did the Aymara say about all this? Do they just have this in language and don't think about it, or is this being analysed from outside, or...
Well, the thing about it is that there's a great deal of poverty in South America still. Right. All of South America was incredibly decimated by the smallpox when the Spaniards came, and the cultures lost a lot. And then they were, of course, all their stuff was stolen, and their documents were burned, and their culture was lost, and they're not in a good state yet. However, it is my belief that sooner or later some of these Amera guys are going to start to get good education, and then they're going to get computers, and then they're going to start doing things with computers that we can't have imagined right now. Mm-hmm. Because if you can think like an American, then you can think like a computer.
Exactly.
A way that we can't in our cultures.
And don't they say, Rand, as well, don't they say when you speak two languages that if you learn two languages as a kid, you automatically, for mathematics and everything else, other sciences, that you can think in two different ways. Your thoughts, you're a bilateral thinker because you speak bilingual.
I'm sure that's true. I'm not one of those, but I certainly believe that is true. And the thing about this Amara is that it's so, the syntax is so pure. Like we have so many exceptions in English, which is probably one of the great languages in the world, simply because of its scope and flexibility.
Sure.
But in terms of actual precision and there's another interesting thing about the Amera, the way they conceive of the past and the future. They believe that we're backing into the future. We're not facing into the future. We're backing into the future because we can see the past and know where we've been, but we can't see behind us, which is the future.
Wow.
And so, yeah.
That's an awesome mindset, isn't it?
It is. It's a very different mindset, and that's the kind of thing that is, that we need, is this shake-up of our assumptions.
Perspective. That's a beautiful perspective there. I like that.
Well, it's, backing into the future, we certainly don't know where we're going. That seems to be the case.
Sure.
And we can't even accurately see where we've been. And as we more accurately see where we've been, we are better able to see where we will go. Mm-hmm. So that's why the paradigm change about what our human history is so important to our future. Is not just by changing the assumptions of what we believe to have happened in the past. Mm-hmm. We are able to open up doors that we're not now perceiving to our future.
Sure. So these Aymara guys aren't far from Tiwanaku, and of course, I'm into archaeoastronomy. I follow the work of Arthur Poznansky. So Poznansky, you're familiar with Poznansky and his ideas? Obviously,
yes.
Because this enhances your date and time and locale as well.
Yes, he is also saying that and there has been various datings of that, and it's not at all settled. However, Poznansky was a Polish astronomer. He was accomplished in what he did, and he applied what he knew about astronomy to the site on Tiwanaku, and he was able to, by the changes of the Earth's axis, etc., be able to calculate a date. And that date goes back to around the time of the destruction of Atlantis. Subsequently, other people have tried to do that, and they've come up with 2 or 3 different answers. But one of them is always around the time of Atlantis.
Mm. Yeah, I think in his Poznansky's day, the accuracy of his measurements might not have been as good as we can do today, but I think the ones that we do today is more accurate, and it's actually more fitting to the time of Atlantis.
Yes. Which brings us to Göbekli Tepe.
Oh, what a sight, Rand! This is a real little hotbed at the moment, isn't it? Göbekli Tepe.
Well, to me, this is the biggest archaeological discovery of all time.
Me too, Rand. Me too.
I don't think that only the actual discovery of a civilizational remains on Antarctica will top it.
Please God that happens,
right now,
Rand. Please God that happens.
But right now, the Göbekli Tepe is the main show, and for the people who don't know a little bit about it, at the same century that Zonk has said that Atlantis was destroyed in this incredible flood, the same century, 9,600 BC, up pops in the middle of this. It's in Turkey near the Syrian border. These structures, 18 feet high, T-shaped pillars made out of stone, requires incredible masonry to be able, not to mention the whole question of moving them.
Sure.
And now that they're dating it to exactly that time, and right within 100 miles of a parameter, if you put Göbekli Tepe in and then you draw a 100-mile diameter around it, you're going to hit a lot of the most ancient, earliest sites of agriculture in the world.
Yeah, this agriculture at a high altitude again, yeah? Yes.
And quite often multitudes of not just one plant or something, but wheat, barley, sheep, pigs, rabbits, this kind of thing, like happening at the same time.
And 15 miles from the Iraqi border as well, right, from Samir.
Yeah, not that far. So, to me, the German archaeologists who are doing this right now have come up with a theory that Göbekli Tepe was some sort of temple. That's why it's called a temple, and it was a religious site, and that's what drew all the people to it. And since the density was so high, because up until this time, hunters and gatherers, maybe 100 people, 200 at the most, right? Suddenly you have 500 or 600 or 1,000 people, and now you need more food than you can hunt, so you turn to agriculture. That's their theory.
Yeah.
My feeling is, however, that these are survivors from Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
They have the masonry skills required to make the stones in the first place.
And artistic as well, Rand, and the artistic skills expressed on these T-shaped megaliths.
Oh, the
carvings
figures that are drawn on.
Sculptors as well. I mean, extremely artistic expression as well. So, evolved is what I'm saying, and highly expressed and advanced and evolved.
Absolutely, and the thing that happens that's so interesting about it is that the earliest ones are the most sophisticated, and as time goes by, they become less sophisticated. It seems as though you have a sudden insertion of advanced masonry skills, who then are then over a period of time degenerate because the original engineers, if you like, die out. That's what happens there.
Yeah, I always talk about like this megalithic, because I love the megaliths, Rand, but I always talk about megalithic devolution, that these guys imitated and mimicked what was going on before, but they had less science as they progressed. So they digressed. There was a devolution in the design and style and knowledge, and from a lost civilization, perhaps. They probably got decimated in the flood and only had a certain numbers to try and kickstart it again. And what you see is a devolution in the megalithic empire, and that goes back to probably Göbekli Tepe. Like, you see a very highly sophisticated and advanced and devolving all the way through.
Yes, that is exactly, and that fits exactly with the idea of the last gasp of an advanced civilization.
Yeah, the last gasp, exactly, Rand. It's like, I think we're looking at fragments, Rand. We're looking at fragments of an empire that just survived against the odds. Now, they didn't survive and become what they were again. They just survived, is what I'm trying to say,
I think their greatest legacy to us, though, was the introduction of agriculture.
Yeah.
Because that seems to have happened simultaneously in Lake Titicaca area with potatoes and
exactly.
All throughout the Middle East, and that fits perfectly with the climatic model proposed by earth crust displacement. Incidentally, just there is a crescent that goes from North Africa all the way to China, and then from India back to the North Africa, which includes the Minoan civilization, the Egyptian civilization, the Sumerian civilization, the Chinese civilization, and the Indian civilization. All of them in this one vast crescent, which I mentioned in my article in the Anthropological Journal of Canada, and I called it the macro crescent, is an area that had been tropical and turned temperate, and immediately to the north of it was an intertemperate zone. So there was plants and animals in the intertemperate zone that survived, and then they migrated into the newly temperate zone, and that's where agriculture occurred. And agriculture is occurring along that line, all the way from Turkey to China, and including India, and also extending down into Egypt. So again, earth crust displacement is explaining the whole thing as one global phenomena.
Sure. This is what I love about your work, Rand. You're tying in so many threads of evidence on many levels, not just this matches up with this. It just all synchronizes together. The historical accounts, the agriculture, the cartography, earth crust displacement, mythology, linguistics. That's quite a wealth of stuff to tie together there, Rand, but it's done beautifully, and it just keeps getting referenced in other parts of the world. It's like all roads head back to Atlantis.
I think so. I do think that they do, and of course we didn't talk so much about the Lost Island Paradise motif, but there is that as well throughout the world. Because when I was studying the flood myths, I paid particular attention to two different motifs. One was the falling sky or moving sun, the sun veering from its normal path. That was one thing that occurred before the flood, which I think was explicable by the earth crust displacement theory. The other thing was this existence of an advanced civilization that existed before the flood. And that is not quite as frequent, but it is very clear. And I'd like to give you an example, three examples that are very interesting because they all have the same sound pattern when they refer to the lost civilization. And that sound pattern is da-da-da-da-da-da, just like na-na-na-na-na-na.
Sure.
And here it is. Among the, we'll start in Japan. Onogorojima. That is the original island home of the Japanese that was believed to be near the pole and was created by the two, a god and goddess, as they spun the earth and caused it to revolve on its axis. And as they brought their great vast spear out of the ocean, bits of droplets fell close to the pole and formed islands. And that means Onogorojima is the island of the congealed drop, the original homeland of the Japanese people. That's their lost civilization. Then we go to the Vedic tradition. It's in India, but I'm going to refer to the Iranian version of the Vedic literature, the Gesta. Anyway, we'll get to the name of the lost paradise is Ariana Dejo. Now, it is, again, an island in the middle of the ocean that is destroyed not just by a flood, but by a dire winter that covers the original homeland in snow and ice.
Wow.
So that's Onogorojima. Ariana Dejo. And then you go to British Columbia again. This is another area in the interior of British Columbia, in the Rockies. Still in British Columbia, there's the Okanagan. And they have Suma Tui Hula. And it was an island paradise in the middle of the ocean that was associated with whiteness. So when you take all those three together, and now there's no known association between the Japanese and the Okanagan, or the Okanagan and ancient Iran, or ancient Iran and Japan, when it goes back to mythology. However, they're all referring to their lost island paradise destroyed by a flood as being with a sound pattern that goes da-da-da-da-da-da.
Fascinating. Funny you mentioned the Japanese there. I wanted to mention to you earlier and I'd forgot, but there's links with the Japanese Ainu and the Basque region of Spain. And the Basque people there are just like they're dropped out of somewhere else. They're different noses. They have a long aquiline nose. The skin is slightly more reddish. Their eyes are different. They look totally different. They speak a different language. But the structure of the Basque language is very, very similar to ancient Japanese Ainu, and nobody can explain this. Perhaps, again, I always look to this common source for these anomalies, and I think that's something else as well. It's largely being unaddressed as well. Of course, there's a lot of influence with the Basque and modern Spanish, and they seem to be getting a bad time of it, and they're almost being, culturally wiped out by influences, other cultural influences, but they do resist, and they are so different and so bizarre. They call them Atlanteans almost. They do actually refer to them as Atlanteans, these Basque people around.
That's it. That is fascinating, and I've always been interested in the Anu as well, because they don't physically resemble the rest of the Japanese population either.
Wow. Yeah. Perhaps a common thread, Rand. This is the thing, it's so vast, Rand, isn't it? We're talking global events here. And the reason I think, and that's what I like about Atlantis Beneath the Ice, that's why we're talking on a global scale, because as you look at Antarctica as a centre of projection, you go in all directions all around the globe. It's why we're talking a global phenomena here.
Absolutely. Even Australia. The interesting thing about Australia is that some of the oldest sites in Australia are in the southeast corner of Australia.
Wow.
We're not coming in from the northwest, but in the southeast. Yeah, some of the oldest sites there are there, and you can't help but wonder whether or not there was some sort of Atlantean influence there. The disadvantage Australia had was not a lot of high land, and so, there are other anomalies like New Zealand, which does have highland doesn't seem to have been populated, and you would have thought that that was a place the Atlanteans might have ended up. But they mainly ended up, it seems to me, in South America, and then although it's not impossible that some of them stayed on Antarctica. Antarctica is a very high altitude land, even though it's been thrust into the polar regions and became polar all year round. It still would have had some parts of it. And they might have had parts of their civilizations, particularly around the Queen Maud areas of Antarctica, which were already, even during the reign of Atlantis, probably considered sort of polar sites in the first place. So those ports were sort of built for the cold weather, and they might have survived for quite a bit of time. And I have been in correspondence with somebody who believes that they have evidence of maps that ancient maps that show trade routes from that part of Antarctica to the Middle East.
Wow!
But that's not published yet. I can't really talk about it. But
fascinating.
Let me just say that there is a possibility that people, even in the dire circumstances of having your whole continent thrust into the polar zone, that parts of your culture, which had been adapted towards the edges of their own polar zone, might have survived. Then you have in the Vedic literature this whole thing about there's this fellow called Tilak. It's on our website as well. Lost Island Paradise of India, and it's called India's Polar's Paradise. If people want to look at that, but Tilak he did I've lost my thought where we're going on that. Oh yes, the idea that there was these sunsets that lasted for days and days and days and days in the Vedic literature. This is what Tilak found. And he became convinced because of this that the Lost Island Paradise had to be near the pole, because that's the only place where you have these sunsets that go on for days and days and days, because they were able to recite the whole Rig Veda, which takes quite a long time to recite, during a sunrise or during a sunset. And that's not physically possible nowadays in an ordinary place. It's only physically possible for you to do that if you are in a polar zone. Now, that could be the north or the south. Tilak chose the north, and I'm just saying it might have been the south.
Beautiful. Fascinating. I just want to ask you one question before we wrap it up. It's about the Prince of Wales Island and the haploid group DNA.
Oh, yes, right, yes.
This is a key thing for me, too.
Okay, so Prince of Wales Island is an island in British Columbia, again, on the west coast. And it's actually in Alaska where they found this. And there was a bear cave there, and archaeologists were doing some research there, and they discovered this body. And when they found the body, it was dated to like 9,000 years ago, which makes it one of the oldest people. And it hit all the newspapers, the oldest Alaskan, and all this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And when they actually began to look into the genetics of it fits most closely with a group of people who live at the very southern tip of South America.
Fascinating.
So and those people also have a very sophisticated language. There's only one speaker left. I mean, we have 2 million American speakers, but this other language, which is name I forget right now, there's only one person left, I think, that can speak it. And the thing about it is the way this particular language has the capacity to have incredibly large vocabularies that can be built up from smaller words. It's a notion of language that we don't really have nowadays. And so that's another area of investigation that probably needs further exploration by some people, because it's an anomaly to have people living, when Magellan went through the straits of that bear his name, there he saw these. Yeah, he saw these people living, very primitively, and their fires and etc. But then it turns out they had this extremely sophisticated language, and it's not inexplicable. However, and that area archaeologically starts to show up around 9,600 BC in terms of people civilization.
Really?
And much more older than the Carthaginians, because it was at before the last crustal displacement, it was at 30 degrees latitude, which is exactly what Giza is today.
Right.
Okay, and not only that, but as you looked east towards the rising sun, you also had the Mediterranean. So you had a mirror effect on the sun rising and the stars happening. So it was, I believe, an ideal location for astronomical observation before 9,600 BC. And then the people who survived from the catastrophe that occurred from that material, if it was taken to anywhere else in the world at 30 degrees, like Giza, all the astronomical evidence that you had gathered prior to would be valid in the present in the present era, where the rock crust had ended up. Mm-hmm. So that's just a side note.
Yeah, just on isn't there a map? I can't remember which one it is now. I think it's they show that Cyan is and the Tropic of Cancer can be calculated, and this anthropomorphic projection that we have centered on Greenwich Mean Time, and it's the center of all our maps, that when you take the anthropomorphic projection of another map, it shows that Cyan and the Tropic of Cancer could be calculated to know all this. So yes, that makes it more complicated, but hey, it's another method, and there's evidence that this Tanawa device existed to map longitude.
I think this is entirely true. I think that this is exactly possible. However, I should note that nobody applied to collect the 20,000 pounds using that technique, and nor successfully acquired the money by doing that. So yeah, that is theoretically in 2020 hindsight, that is it is true that if you can look back and say they could have, had they known this, then they might have seen this. Sure. And that's true. It's true. It's absolutely true. You can, if you have extremely sophisticated knowledge of the movements of the stars and the moons, you can use astronomy to calculate longitude. But it requires immense amounts of observation and continuous over centuries. It's not just like a decade or two. You need centuries of calculations to be able to really have the kind of accuracy that would be required. Incidentally, just speaking of that, I believe that, and this is a startling argument, maybe startling, but I believe that Carthage was once the site of a very ancient civilization.
How much it drifted, and they can actually date these maps when they were actually originally drawn up.
Yeah, that's what we did do in Atlantis Beneath the Ice, and I think we were the first to do that with that. Although I did do it in a paper for an online journal a few years back. What it is because, like you say, there is tilt, say 23.5 degrees. It goes through a cycle, goes down to 21.8, goes up to 24.4. At the time of the last displacement, it was at its greatest, 9,600 BC, at the time when there was this displacement. It was at 24.4. That is its maximum tilt. Today, it's declined down to 23.5, and it continues to decline. It will continue to decline for several thousand more years now until it gets to 21.8, and then we go back up again. So this is a very slow cycle. It takes 41,000 years to complete the cycle. But the point about it is that there's discrepancy when Charles Hapgood was trying to find the center of what's called the Piri Reis map.
Yeah.
He thought it might have been sand, which is present-day Aswan, which was very close to the Tropic of Cancer, and so he couldn't determine which it was, and I realized.
Sure. Just for the listeners, Rand, the marine chronometer is the device that the British invented, and it takes in the roll, and it works because of the roll and pitch of a ship. A pendulum clock's not going to work, so pendulums are no good on ships. But so this marine chronometer was able to, go to sea basically, and that's what was invented. I think we talked last time, Rand, and I quite like this, and I had another guy on the show. I didn't quite agree with some of the stuff, but I was telling him as well about this Tanawa, this device called a Tanawa that the Africans had, and when they were at sea, they were able to have. Now the problem with this is you need to have very advanced moon calculations, but they could have used the moon as a reference point and got longitude that way. Now it's a different way of doing it. It's more intuitive knowledge. They obviously didn't have a technological voice. All they did was measure the angle to the moon, but if you knew where the moon was going to be over its 19-year cycle, and you need to have moon tables.
That the drift of the Earth's tilt, it can be measured in terms of the seconds, the distance between the Tropic of Cancer now and when it was last over a sin, can be calculated out to an exact date. And that's what we did in Atlantis Beneath the Ice, and that's
3775 BC, I think it was the last.
That's right. Yeah.
That blows me away, Rand. That just blows me away, because you look and you go, well, you can get so much information out of a map, and this is what I'm talking about. The tangible evidence is there. You just need to know the science of cartography. It's all encoded in the map. There's a high science there. You don't just draw a couple of continents on a map and hopefully you get it to look right. It's much more than that. There's so much science in it.
And the other thing that's interesting is the projection itself is what's called an azimuthal equidistance projection. This is the kind of thing that the Americans used and the Russians used in the Cold War. They would take Moscow, for example, and they'd make that the center of the world, and then they would create a map around Moscow so they could see where's the closest place I could get to Moscow that is in my territory, which turned out to be Turkey, hence the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so those maps, which are sort of orientated towards